For more than 3 decades, the world believed it knew Maureen O'Hara. She was Hollywood's fiery redhead, the woman who matched men scene for scene, word for word, without ever softening herself to fit the system. On screen, she radiated strength, honor, and moral clarity. Off-screen, the public assumed her life mirrored that same bold confidence. But behind the carefully preserved image was a truth few ever suspected. Maureen O'Hara was living a double life, not out of deception, but out of survival. In Hollywood's golden age, image was everything. Studios didn't just sell films, they manufactured identities. For actresses, especially those who refused to play submissive roles, the margin for error was razor thin. O'Hara quickly learned that being outspoken came at a cost. She was respected, but she was also quietly labeled difficult, independent but not manageable, strong but not safe. And so, early in her career, she made a decision that would shape the next 30 years of her life. She would give Hollywood exactly what it wanted to see, and nothing more. Publicly, O'Hara became the embodiment of dignity. She avoided scandal, refused to participate in gossip culture, and kept her private life tightly sealed. While other stars were followed relentlessly by photographers and columnists, O'Hara's name rarely appeared in headlines unrelated to her work. This wasn't accidental. It was discipline. She compartmentalized her existence with precision, creating a boundary between her professional persona and her real self that almost no one was allowed to cross. What the public didn't know was that once the cameras stopped rolling, O'Hara withdrew completely. She did not seek validation from Hollywood insiders. She did not chase relevance. Instead, she constructed a life rooted in privacy, routine, and control, a stark contrast to the chaos often associated with fame. Friends later described her as intensely guarded, deeply reflective, and unwaveringly private. Even those closest to her understood that there were questions you simply did not ask. This separation became more pronounced as the industry changed. As Hollywood shifted toward younger faces and more compliant personalities, O'Hara found herself increasingly out of place. Rather than fight for space in a system she no longer believed in, she stepped back, quietly, deliberately. To the public, it appeared as though she was fading away. In reality, she was reclaiming ownership of her life. For nearly 30 years, O'Hara maintained this dual existence. One version of her remained frozen in time, preserved in classic films, reruns, and nostalgic memories. The other lived far from premieres and publicity, focused on family, personal values, and a sense of peace Hollywood had never offered her. She never announced her withdrawal. She never explained herself. Silence became her shield. What makes this story so unsettling is not that O'Hara hid a scandal or a secret identity. It is that she hid herself. In an industry that demanded constant access to women's bodies, emotions, and personal lives, her refusal to fully surrender was an act of quiet rebellion. Living a double life was the only way she could remain whole. It wasn't until much later, when time had softened public curiosity and fame no longer required maintenance, that fragments of the truth began to surface. In rare interviews, O'Hara spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity. She acknowledged the pressure, the judgment, and the exhaustion of existing in a world that celebrated her strength while subtly punishing it. When asked whether she ever felt misunderstood, she did not hesitate. The misunderstanding, she implied, was the price of self-preservation. Part 1 of this story is not about revelation. It is about context, about understanding why a woman at the height of fame would choose distance over dominance, silence over spectacle. For Maureen O'Hara, living two lives was never about fooling the world. It was about surviving it. As the years passed, the distance between Hollywood and Maureen O'Hara became more than physical. It became philosophical. The industry that once celebrated her strength no longer recognized the kind of woman she was, or perhaps never truly had. Fame had rewarded her talent, but it had also demanded access to her inner life, something she had never been willing to give. By stepping away, O'Hara did not retreat in defeat. She disengaged on her own terms. Away from the spotlight, her life followed a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the volatility of studio-era Hollywood. She found grounding in structure, family, and heritage. Ireland, in particular, represented something Hollywood never could: continuity. There were no roles to audition for, no expectations to manage, no image to defend. For the first time in decades, she existed without performance. That absence of spectacle was not emptiness, it was relief. What makes O'Hara's double life so striking is how long it remained invisible. Unlike many stars who leave behind dramatic exits or public reckonings, she left quietly. No memoir tour, no exposé, no final declaration. Her silence allowed the public to romanticize her disappearance, assuming comfort, wealth, and contentment filled the gap. But the truth was more complex. Living privately came with its own cost. To be unseen after being so visible required emotional recalibration, a willingness to let go of applause without replacing it. Those who encountered O'Hara in her later years often remarked on her composure. She was polite, reserved, and firm. There was no desperation to be remembered, no bitterness toward an industry that had moved on. If anything, she appeared lighter. The woman who once guarded her personal life with near-military precision no longer needed to defend it. Time had done the work for her. It was only through fragments, a comment here, a reflection there, that the outline of her double life became clearer. She spoke candidly about Hollywood's contradictions, how strength in a woman was praised on screen but discouraged behind it, how independence was marketable only when it could be controlled. These were not accusations. They were observations delivered without drama. And perhaps the restraint made them more powerful. O'Hara understood something many never do. Visibility is not the same as agency. For years, the public saw her constantly, yet knew almost nothing about her interior world. By choosing withdrawal, she reversed that imbalance. She became unseen, but self-directed. The double life she maintained was not an act of dishonesty. It was an act of authorship. In retrospect, her story forces an uncomfortable question. How many other women of that era survived by dividing themselves? How many smiles concealed fatigue? How many perfect careers were sustained by emotional absence? O'Hara's difference was not that she endured these pressures. It was that she refused to let them define her entire existence. By the time broader audiences began revisiting her legacy, the narrative had shifted. She was no longer framed solely as a classic Hollywood star, but as a woman who protected herself in an era that rarely protected women. The double life, once hidden, became a testament rather than a secret. It reframed her disappearance not as decline, but as intention. Part 2 of this story is about consequence, about what it means to choose privacy in a culture that feeds on exposure, about the quiet courage required to step away without explanation. Maureen O'Hara did not live two lives because she wanted to deceive the world. She lived two lives because one was never enough to hold both fame and truth. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. Some legacies are built through constant visibility. Others are preserved through absence. O'Hara chose the latter, and in doing so, ensured that the most important part of her life finally belonged to her alone. Even after stepping away from Hollywood, Maureen O'Hara's presence remained palpable. Her films continued to be shown on television, in retrospectives, and in theaters that celebrated the Golden Age. Audiences who had never met her were still captivated by her fiery gaze, her commanding voice, the energy she brought to every scene. But the Maureen O'Hara of these screenings was only one facet of the woman herself, a carefully curated image that had been built over decades and preserved with meticulous care. Behind that image was another life, one lived quietly, intentionally, and largely invisible. In Ireland, O'Hara embraced routines that allowed her to connect with the parts of herself that Hollywood had never demanded. She cultivated friendships with people who knew her as a neighbor, a companion, or a mentor, not as a legend or an icon. She found solace in landscapes that reminded her of childhood, in long walks across fields, in the simplicity of day-to-day domesticity. It was a rhythm that Hollywood could never provide, freedom from expectation. For decades, she had performed, not just in films, but in life itself, modulating her personality to fit the scripts of public perception. Now, she could exist without scripts, without direction, without judgment. Yet, living a double life was not without its complexities. Even removed from the spotlight, O'Hara remained aware of her public image, of the legend she had created through her work. She had to navigate the delicate balance between accessibility and privacy. Journalists occasionally sought interviews, fan letters arrived in volumes, and Hollywood colleagues reached out to her for opinions or appearances. Each interaction required careful consideration. Would engaging with the world dilute the private self she had fought to preserve? Would ignoring it entirely risk erasure from history? She managed these tensions with the same precision she had once applied to her career, asserting boundaries without alienating those who admired her. Part of the dual existence O'Hara maintained involved reconciling her public accomplishments with her personal truths. To the world, she was the confident, independent star of The Quiet Man, Miracle on 34th Street, and countless other films. To herself, she was a woman who had loved, lost, struggled, and persevered, experiences that could never be fully expressed on screen. She had navigated complex relationships, endured personal disappointments, and made decisions that prioritized her sense of self over external validation. These choices were invisible to the public, but were central to who she was. In later years, O'Hara began to reflect on this duality with surprising clarity. She spoke in interviews about the sacrifices she had made, not in a tone of regret, but of sober acknowledgement. She recognized the cost of fame, the demands of public attention, and the subtle pressures placed on women to conform. Yet she also celebrated the freedoms she had carved out for herself. Living two lives, she realized, had been less about deception and more about survival, about asserting control in a world that often demanded submission. The final decades of her life were marked by this quiet assertion of agency. She chose where and how she appeared, what she revealed and what she concealed. She formed relationships on her terms, nurtured her passions privately, and let the legend of Maureen O'Hara speak for itself while preserving the private life she valued most. In doing so, she created a legacy that was not only about talent and beauty, but also about resilience, intelligence, and self-determination. Looking back, it becomes clear that O'Hara's life challenges the assumptions of fame and the mythology of Hollywood. Not every story is meant to be told in the glare of publicity. Some are meant to be lived quietly and fully behind the scenes. Her double life, once a source of concealment, ultimately became a testament to the complexity of human existence, a reminder that a person's worth is not measured solely by public recognition, but by the courage it takes to live authentically. Part 3 concludes with the understanding that Maureen O'Hara's story is as much about what she chose to keep hidden as what she allowed the world to see. Fame may immortalize images, but it cannot capture the full depth of a life lived deliberately. For O'Hara, the life she guarded was the one that truly mattered, and through it, she preserved the essence of her independence, strength, and humanity, lessons that remain relevant far beyond the silver screen. Even in her final decades, Maureen O'Hara carried the weight of duality with grace. The world saw her as a Hollywood legend, a fiery star whose films were etched into cinematic history. But the life she had meticulously guarded, the life of quiet reflection, personal choices, and private joys, remained largely invisible. It was a testament to her intelligence and discipline that she could navigate both worlds without allowing one to collapse into the other. While audiences admired her on screen, O'Hara was quietly mastering the art of self-possession off it. Her personal relationships were central to this hidden life. while colleagues and fans only glimpsed fleeting interactions or public appearances. O'Hara's connections with family, close friends, and confidants revealed a depth and complexity unknown to the public. She maintained friendships over decades, often corresponding privately through letters or phone calls, nurturing bonds with patience and care. These relationships, removed from the glare of cameras and gossip, were where she found authenticity, where her voice and her spirit could be fully expressed. Love, too, was part of the life she protected. Unlike the public's fascination with glamorous Hollywood romances, O'Hara's personal attachments were grounded in trust, respect, and discretion. She loved intensely, but she did not perform love for an audience. Her heart and her affections were fiercely private, shielded from speculation and rumor. In a world obsessed with scandal, she preserved her dignity by refusing to allow her most intimate connections to be co-opted by the press. It was this deliberate choice, to love without exhibition, that allowed her relationships to endure and deepen over time. O'Hara also embraced the slower rhythms of daily life, away from the frenzied pace of Hollywood. She cultivated passions that were entirely hers: reading, travel, and exploring her Irish heritage. These pursuits grounded her, providing a sanctuary where the pressures of fame could not intrude. Each day was a deliberate act of self-determination, a reaffirmation that her identity was not defined by the role she played on screen, but by the choices she made in private. In these spaces, O'Hara was not a star. She was simply herself, a woman of intellect, humor, and resilience. Perhaps the most striking aspect of her double life was the quiet courage it demanded. It is easy to imagine that living as a star offers comfort, adulation, and privilege. But maintaining a private life alongside public fame requires discipline, strategic thinking, and emotional stamina. O'Hara navigated these demands with remarkable skill. She understood the fleeting nature of celebrity and the persistent hunger of the media for personal details. By establishing clear boundaries, she controlled her narrative without sacrificing her privacy. This was a rare feat in an industry that thrives on exposure, rumor, and spectacle. O'Hara's final reflections, shared sparingly in interviews and memoirs, reveal a woman who understood both the cost and the value of her choices. She acknowledged the sacrifices, the moments of isolation, the absence from public life, the careful negotiation of friendships and relationships, but she also recognized the reward: a life lived authentically. The duality that had shaped her existence was not a burden, but a strategy, a means of asserting control in a world that often sought to strip it away. By living two lives, she ensured that her most important one, the private, unobserved life, remained intact. In the end, Maureen O'Hara's story is not simply one of celebrity or screen legend. It is a story of agency, of resilience, and of the profound power of privacy. Her dual existence allowed her to navigate the pressures of fame without losing herself, to embrace love without compromise, and to enjoy her later years with a sense of freedom that few stars ever experience. She demonstrated that the truest measure of strength is not how one appears in public, but how one protects the self when no one is watching. Part 4 closes on this reflection. The legacy of Maureen O'Hara is layered, rich, and enduring. The public remembers the star, but the life she quietly preserved, the life lived with integrity, choice, and discretion, offers a deeper, more compelling lesson. True courage is often invisible, and in her example, it is profoundly human. By choosing to live authentically in both public and private spheres, O'Hara crafted a life that was fully her own, leaving behind an enduring story of quiet triumph beyond the silver screen. As Maureen O'Hara entered her final years, the world began to perceive her not only as a screen legend, but also as a woman who had navigated life on her own terms. The revelation of her double life, carefully maintained for 3 decades, added a new dimension to the public's understanding of her. It was no longer just about the fiery redhead who captivated audiences in The Quiet Man, or the strong, principled heroines of her films. It was about the choices she made behind the scenes, the deliberate cultivation of privacy, and the quiet authority she exercised over her own narrative. O'Hara reflected on the peculiar paradox of fame, the simultaneous adulation and isolation it brought. On screen, she embodied confidence, resilience, and defiance. And yet, in reality, she often felt unseen in the ways that mattered most. The world celebrated her performances, but remained unaware of the intricate balance she maintained to preserve her private life. Each public appearance, each smile at a premiere, each handshake for a photograph was part of a performance that protected the life she valued above all else. It was not deception, but preservation, the careful guarding of a soul against the demands of a world that too often consumes what it admires. Those closest to O'Hara noticed the depth of her intentionality. Her conversations, when not for public consumption, revealed a sharp mind and a reflective spirit. She spoke with clarity about the illusions of Hollywood, the fleeting nature of celebrity, and the strength required to maintain integrity in the face of relentless scrutiny. To live two lives for 30 years demanded discipline, foresight, and resilience, qualities that few in the public eye could sustain. And yet, she carried it with grace, rarely allowing frustration or resentment to seep into her carefully curated existence. The lessons of her double life were profound. For one, O'Hara demonstrated that visibility does not equal understanding. Millions may have admired her on screen, yet few truly knew her. Her story challenges the assumption that fame reveals the full truth of a person. Instead, it underscores that even the most public lives can be deeply private, that strength and vulnerability often coexist unseen. By living two lives, she claimed agency over her own story, choosing what to reveal and what to protect, what to share and what to leave behind. Another lesson was the value of autonomy. In an industry that often demanded submission to image makers, studio executives, and public expectation, O'Hara carved out a space where she could make her own decisions. Her withdrawal from the public was not retreat, but strategy, a conscious decision to define her own terms of engagement with fame. This autonomy allowed her to cultivate relationships, hobbies, and a sense of peace that Hollywood could never provide. It was a rare form of empowerment, achieved not through defiance alone, but through sustained, deliberate choice. Even in her final reflections, O'Hara emphasized the importance of living authentically. She acknowledged the sacrifices, moments of solitude, the careful navigation of relationships, the constant vigilance required to maintain privacy, but she also embraced the rewards. A life lived according to one's own principles, she suggested, is far more meaningful than one lived in constant display. Her double life, once a necessity, ultimately became a form of liberation. It allowed her to remain fully herself, unbroken by the pressures of the industry, unbowed by expectation, and unconsumed by the spotlight. Maureen O'Hara's story closes not with scandal, but with insight. The narrative of the Hollywood legend is inseparable from the narrative of the private woman who sustained her integrity for decades. Her double life is not a secret to be sensationalized, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is a reminder that the most remarkable achievements are often unseen, that courage can be quiet, and that the true measure of a life is not in applause, but in the deliberate choices made when no one is watching. By living fully in both worlds, public and private, O'Hara left behind more than films. She left a blueprint for how to navigate fame without surrendering selfhood, for how to claim agency in a world that prizes conformity, and for how to preserve dignity amidst relentless exposure. Her legacy is layered, complex, and enduring. The story of a woman who lived boldly, both on screen and in the shadows of her own carefully protected life, and who, in the end, chose to be remembered not just as a star, but as a woman who defined her own destiny. In the final chapter of her life, Maureen O'Hara's dual existence became more than a personal choice. it became a quiet legend. The Hollywood she had once known had changed beyond recognition. Studios no longer demanded contracts of iron, but the world remained hungry for stories, for glimpses behind the curtain of fame. O'Hara, having mastered the art of discretion, chose what the world would see and what it would never know. Even in her twilight years, she moved with the same composure and deliberate intention that had defined her entire life. Her private life, cultivated over decades, remained a sanctuary. O'Hara spent her days immersed in activities that nourished the soul rather than the public eye, walking the Irish countryside, reading, reflecting, and fostering relationships built on trust rather than notoriety. She surrounded herself with people who knew her for who she truly was, not for the characters she portrayed on screen. These moments of quiet intimacy were her true luxury: freedom from expectation, freedom from judgment, and freedom to simply exist. In interviews during her later years, O'Hara revealed glimpses of the reasoning behind her decades-long double life. She spoke not with regret or bitterness, but with clarity and calm understanding. Fame, she explained, was a gift, but it came with strings. Those strings, if not carefully managed, could pull an individual into compromises and concessions that erode personal integrity. By maintaining a private life alongside her public persona, she retained control over her destiny. She had chosen to exist on her own terms, and in doing so, preserved a core part of herself that fame could never reach. O'Hara's story challenges the conventional narrative of Hollywood celebrity. The public tends to equate visibility with truth, assuming that the star we see on screen is the sum total of the person. In her case, the truth was far more nuanced. Her private life was rich, deliberate, and fiercely protected, and it existed alongside a public image that, while legendary, was only part of the story. By living two lives, O'Hara demonstrated a rare form of autonomy, one that allowed her to navigate fame without being consumed by it. Perhaps the most striking aspect of her final years was her reflection on what it meant to live authentically. O'Hara never lamented the sacrifices her double life required. Instead, she embraced them as necessary steps in the pursuit of a meaningful existence. Living privately allowed her to experience love, friendship, and contentment in ways that Hollywood could never offer. It allowed her to escape the performative demands of fame and claim ownership of her own story. Her life became a study in intentionality. Every choice made with consideration, every boundary enforced with resolve, and every moment lived in alignment with her values. As news of her passing spread, public fascination naturally surged. Media outlets recounted her greatest films, her iconic performances, and her influence on generations of actors. Yet the deeper truth, the decades spent cultivating a life removed from the limelight, added a layer of complexity to her legacy. Audiences began to appreciate not just the actress who commanded the screen, but the woman who commanded her life. The double life that had once been a necessity was now recognized as a triumph, a testament to her intelligence, her discipline, and her indomitable spirit. Maureen O'Hara's final reflections reveal a woman who understood the fleeting nature of fame, the impermanence of public adulation, and the enduring value of personal agency. She showed that true courage is not always loud or public. It is often quiet, persistent, and unyielding. Living a double life was never about deception. It was about survival, dignity, and the right to exist fully on one's own terms. It was about preserving a self that fame could not define or diminish. In the end, her life leaves a lasting lesson for generations to come, that the measure of a person is not in how they are seen, but in how they choose to live. Maureen O'Hara's story is a reminder that freedom, integrity, and self-possession are achievements as profound as any award, any accolade, or any public recognition. Her legacy transcends the screen, enduring as the story of a woman who lived boldly, loved privately, and ultimately defined her own destiny, a legend in the spotlight, and a sovereign in the shadows.